A police officer who works in Stockton, California, one of America's neighborhoods with the highest crime rates, tries to keep his identity as an officer completely hidden due to the area he lives in. Rain puddles along broken roads and cigarette butts piled up near sidewalks reflected the grim atmosphere of the streets. It felt as if the sun never touched this neighborhood. The oppressive vibe and narrow alleyways hinted at shady activities behind the scenes. Michael, a black police officer, masked his identity as an officer with his casual attire, bandanas, baggy pants, and long-sleeved, colorful plaid shirts. When not wearing a shirt, he would sport a purple and gold LA Lakers jersey with 23 and LeBron James emblazoned on the back. His left arm bore a crocodile skin and dragon tattoo that, upon closer inspection, appeared detailed, but looked like random scribbles from a distance. When heading to work, he would carefully iron his tie for 10 minutes and never left without his tie clip. Depending on his breakfast, he would choose his belt size, tighter for cereal, looser for bacon and sausages. After slipping into his boots, he would get dressed fully at the precinct's locker room rather than in his neighborhood. Michael believed there were many suspicious individuals living nearby, making it unsafe to wear his police uniform openly. Sometimes he would throw on a sweatshirt or go completely undercover before changing into his uniform at work. One morning, around 9:45, Michael stopped by a coffee shop, Susan's Coffee, near his neighborhood to grab an Americano. This time, he was wearing his uniform and accompanied by his chatty colleague, Steve. Steve, oblivious to their surroundings, loudly ate a donut, making Michael feel uneasy. The cafe's ambiance began to suffocate him. The long chandeliers seemed to press down on him, and the red seats looked disturbingly like pools of blood. Michael noticed some familiar faces from his neighborhood and immediately knew they weren't friendly. The baggy pants they wore appeared to conceal weapons at their backs. Michael was well aware of how the locals viewed law enforcement. He adjusted his hat low over his eyes and pulled his jacket up to cover his mouth. Meanwhile, Steve, completely clueless, shouted, "Michael, did you see Jasmine's ass at the office? Total peach, man, as big as my head." Michael tried to brush it off with a simple, yeah, attempting to end the conversation. To escape the tension, he faked a dispatch call and convinced Steve to leave with him. As they headed for the door, Michael discreetly left $3.50 on the table. While leaving, they accidentally bumped shoulders with one of Michael's neighbors. Steve spilled coffee all over the man's sweatshirt, soaking it completely. The man, James, took a deep breath, visibly annoyed, and pushed Steve away while saying, "Get out of my way." From a short distance of about 5 feet, Michael intervened, deepening his voice as he said, "My apologies, sir." He quickly asked Susan to refresh their coffee and bring an apple pie, assuring her he'd pay later. James paused, staring at Michael's face, which made Michael instinctively turn his head to avoid being recognized. James, skeptical, eventually dismissed the thought of someone from his 22-year-old neighborhood being a cop. Michael seized the moment, grabbing Steve by the arm and dragging him to their car. While doing so, a parking receipt slipped out of Michael's pocket. It was a ticket from a parking lot at the entrance of his neighborhood in Stockton. James was shocked when he saw a police officer leave their car there and picked up the receipt from the ground. However, it only listed a 2-hour parking fee and the date April 24th, 11, nothing else. When he flipped the paper over, he noticed the initials MZ written on the back. Unable to make sense of it, James tossed the receipt onto the table of a nearby kid, MC Michael Carson. Michael, despite being a police officer for years, had never disclosed his profession to anyone in his civilian life, nor had he made it obvious until today. That's because for the first time, he ran into people from his neighborhood at one of his favorite bistros, Susan's Coffee. Michael got into a car with Steve, buckled up, and drove to Purcell Street to perform radar maintenance. After about 5 hours, his shift ended, and he returned to the station. He then hopped into his 2007 pickup truck and headed home. As he drove down his street, he saw James, the same guy who had spilled coffee on himself earlier that day, and froze for a moment. But he couldn't show his reaction. His brief glance toward James triggered a strange sense of unease in him. Noticing Michael's car, James called out, "Hey, buddy, come hang out with us." Michael's forehead was damp with sweat, and his underarms felt unusually soaked. He was nervous, afraid they might have figured him out. Even though Michael had known James for years, he had no clue what he was walking into. Maybe they just wanted to shoot some hoops, or maybe they had figured out his secret and were ready to confront him. After all, in this neighborhood, police officers and men of justice weren't exactly welcome. Everyone in the area believed Michael to be self-employed, occasionally working as a courier, car washer, or taxi driver. Nobody suspected he was a cop. Michael parked his car, adjusted his hair one last time in the rearview mirror, and stepped out with a friendly smile. "Hey, James, what's up, man?" he said. James responded with a suspicious tone. "I'm good, buddy. How about you?" Michael tensed up, dropped his gaze to the ground, and nervously scratched the back of his head. Absent-mindedly, he asked, "Want to play some basketball?" But they both knew James hated basketball, and Michael knew it too. Hearing the offer, James cracked a smile. Everyone in the neighborhood knew he despised basketball. "Man, you've had a long day. Go home and rest," James said. Relieved, Michael nodded, mumbled, "See you around, Asai," and walked away, taking 3 slow steps before he heard a voice call out, "Michael!" Startled, Michael froze and turned around. It was James. "Did you know that today 2 dumb cops spilled coffee all over me at a cafe?" James asked. Without thinking, Michael replied, "Yeah, I know. It was an accident." James was stunned. How could Michael know that? He wasn't there, or at least that's what James thought. Raising an eyebrow and sliding a hand into his pocket, James asked, "How do you know that, huh?" Michael, now surprisingly at ease, shot back with a smirk, "Of course I don't know, you idiot," and laughed it off. Then he headed home, opened the door, and was greeted by the comforting aroma of lasagna. His wife had cooked his favorite meal. Michael loved lasagna so much that he practically begged his wife to make it at least twice a month. As he called out to his wife, he felt a wave of relief wash over him. Returning to the same house, eating the same meal, it gave him peace. Yet in recent days, that peace and sense of security had begun to fade. That night, the events at Susan's Coffee lingered in his mind. James's demeanor and that parking receipt, everything seemed so different now. What once felt normal now carried the weight of hidden animosity within the neighborhood. As he entered the house, Michael smiled at his wife and said, "Thanks for the lasagna." His wife stuck her head out from the kitchen and asked, "Welcome home, honey. How was your day?" Michael stared at her for a long time. He was struggling to keep his complicated feelings from showing in his eyes. He needed to say something, but the right words just wouldn't come. "It was good," he mumbled finally. But his wife could immediately tell from the look on her face that his answer was a lie. Michael, deciding not to let her be indifferent any longer, looked into her eyes, but still, he didn't know what to say. Just then, Michael's phone began to ring. It was Steve's name on the screen. Michael quickly answered the phone. "How's it going?" Steve asked, his voice hurried and excited. "Is something wrong? Where are you?" Michael took a deep breath and hung up the phone. The meaningless urgency in Steve's voice had completely extinguished his desire to talk any longer. Michael ended the night by saying goodnight to his wife. The darkness inside, much like the cold and dreary air outside, seemed to draw him in. He needed to sleep, but his mind wouldn't let him relax. Something was approaching, but what? Slowly, he closed his eyes, but for a moment, the insomnia caused everything in his vision to reshape into nightmares. The next morning, Michael tried to go through his daily routine: breakfast, getting dressed, getting in the car. Everything seemed normal. But something was missing. A hole had seeped into the normalcy of everything. That morning, the tension from Susan's Coffee still lingered in his mind. He would never forget the fear he felt in that moment. He slowly started to sense that something wasn't right, that there was something hidden behind the parking ticket and James's behavior. The unease inside him whispered that there was more going on. It wasn't just the pressure of the neighborhood or the tension that came with being a cop. There was something else. As he drove to work, Michael tried to appear calm as usual behind the wheel. But something caught his eye. Right in front of him, there was a group of men walking down the street. Their black jackets and hats made them look familiar. These men were members of the local drug gangs. Michael recognized one of them, James. James, being so close again, made Michael uneasy. As the car sped along, Michael felt something stir within him, but he kept it to himself. The people in his neighborhood had a way of understanding each other just by looking into their eyes. No one trusted anyone here. Michael briefly accelerated, trying to shake the unease, but as he turned the next corner, James's eyes stayed with him in his mind. The internal unrest continued at work. Steve was tense and anxious. "Michael, something's off, isn't it?" Steve asked. Michael paused, looking into Steve's eyes for a moment. But right then he had no reason to trust him. Steve was just a colleague, nothing more. Michael put on a slight smile and replied, "No, everything's fine." But inside, he didn't believe it. By the end of the day, Michael's mind was more scrambled than ever. The unease he felt about his neighborhood, old friends, and especially James, made him withdraw into himself. During lunch, he didn't want to go to Susan's Coffee, the usual spot. But he thought he might find answers to his questions there. He called Steve and suggested they have a coffee together. Steve immediately agreed. As they walked into the coffee shop, Michael couldn't shake the events of earlier from his mind. The voices in his head whispered that something was wrong, that something had gone awry. Steve, laughing, said, "By the way, I can't stop thinking about Jasmine's hips." Michael remained silent for a moment. His eyes wandered around the ceiling as his thoughts deepened. After all, he couldn't trust anyone here. As they neared the door of Susan's Coffee, Michael's heart started to race. When he walked inside, his eyes immediately focused on the room. He felt that today everything would be different. Everything was changing. Now all the calmness in this coffee shop was replaced by a strange tension. Once they sat down, Steve loudly placed his order while Michael quietly began observing the surroundings, and then his eyes locked onto someone he recognized, James. This time, Michael felt like he was facing a threat, and just how close he was. The look in his eyes pushed Michael back once more. James suddenly took a step toward Michael, increasing his unease. "Today, coffee spilled on my clothes at a coffee shop," James said, taking another step closer to Michael. "I know," Michael replied, narrowing his eyes. For a moment, James stared at Michael, surprised. "You know?" "How?" he asked. Michael, feeling uncomfortable, took a step back. "I don't know, you fool," he said, trying to force a laugh. But the laugh was strained. For a brief moment, he looked at James's face and noticed something had shifted in his eyes. Something was coming, Dot. Their eyes met, exchanging a slow-building tension. As James watched Michael, without suspecting that James had something planned, kept his gaze averted. Michael realized the atmosphere in Susan's Coffee was rapidly deteriorating. James's gaze had become heavy, as though it could trigger a confrontation at any moment. But despite paying such close attention, Michael couldn't predict what would happen next. The unease he felt wasn't just due to the rising danger in the neighborhood. It was a reflection of his own internal conflict. In those grim moments, a voice deep inside Michael whispered that everything had become irreparably complicated. With every step James took, the threat grew more tangible. Michael tried to ignore the warnings, just like he always did. But this time, things felt different. The thoughts swirling in his mind, his response to James was colder, more distant. James took another step forward. Now, they were only inches apart. An internal fear echoed in Michael's chest. As James looked deeply into Michael's eyes, the sharp smile that appeared between his lips seemed to darken the already grim night even further. "Do you really know me, Michael?" James asked, his voice laced with mockery. "I've started to suspect you're a cop, and I can see something changing in the way you look at me." Michael squinted. "I don't know. I don't want to deal with you," he said, but his voice was so cold that the sincerity of his words was questionable. The tension inside him grew stronger with each passing moment. He noticed the strange expression in James's eyes, but he still didn't know what to do. James took another step. "I know," he said quietly. "You're making a mistake, Michael. I know you were there, at Susan's coffee. I found the parking ticket. Do you realize that everything with me is different?" A moment of realization hit Michael's mind, the parking ticket, Susan's coffee, and something he hadn't noticed before. He wondered how James knew so much. But just then, he saw a man walking down the street. His eyes quickly scanned, and something started to click in Michael's mind. James slowly turned his back, still keeping his gaze fixed on Michael. "You're following me, aren't you?" James said. "And you still don't get it. While no one in this neighborhood realizes you're a cop, you're leaving the trail of a cop. We all know you." Michael took a deep breath, trying to fight the fear rising inside him. This was the turning point. He had never felt so alone. He locked eyes with James one last time, and something inside him shattered. This place was no longer safe for Michael. James said, "You think being a cop protects you, but here everything's different." Then he turned and walked away quickly. Michael kept his eyes closed for a moment longer. In those moments, time seemed to stop. But sadly, the realization that everything had shifted, that the darkness was only one step away, pushed Michael into a deep void. A split-second decision forced Michael to move. He opened the car door, quickly jumped inside, and leaned toward the steering wheel. As every thought and feeling swirled in his mind, things slowly started to fall into place. However, the increasing complexity of everything did nothing to ease his discomfort. Steve's phone call grabbed Michael's attention. "Michael, you shouldn't get involved in this," he said. "Just a guess, but this might be too big for you." Michael hung up the phone and took a deep breath. He was so confused that he didn't know what to do. Although what Steve had said was horrifying, Michael was so uneasy now that he wasn't sure how accurate his feelings were. The emptiness inside him reminded him of a memory filled with dark secrets from the past. In Stockton, California, in a high-crime neighborhood, everything was hidden. Someone was always one step ahead. Maybe that was what put Michael in such a tough spot. As he slowly drove his car, his eyes always drifted to the same street. James and everything that had changed since that day were following him like a threat. Michael's fear deepened with every step he took. After all, being a cop in this neighborhood was just a mask. Hiding his true identity was the only way to survive. But now, that mask didn't mean anything anymore. That night, everything in Michael's mind was dark. But there was something. Something started to burn inside him like a spark. In these streets, in this grim atmosphere, there was no one who wanted to take his place. And maybe, when the time came, he would have to face the reality that everything would be completely different. A few hours later, Michael returned home. When he entered the room, he heard his wife's voice. The tension on Michael's face caught her attention. "Something happened," she said, concern in her eyes. "Everything's fine," Michael said, but this time, lying wasn't as easy. At that moment, the fear in his wife's eyes turned the whole night into a nightmare, and Michael realized that everything had reached a point where it couldn't be controlled anymore. When he looked into his wife's eyes, he began to feel the pain of what had happened even deeper. His wife had known him for years, but Michael was no longer the same Michael. Michael regretted doing this job more than ever. He wanted some things to end. He was tired of his neighborhood and the person he had become. He wanted to get away. There was a huge change between who he wanted to be and who he was. He apologized to his wife and acted like everything was fine. He opened the closet, grabbed the first hoodie and sweatpants he could find and got ready. He didn't know what to do. He strapped his gun on and went downstairs to put on his shoes. His hands were shaking from the tension, and he could barely tie his laces. When his wife asked where he was going, he said, "Don't worry, I'll be back soon." And maybe this was the last time he was saying goodbye to her. He walked to James's house. As he walked, he noticed cigarette butts, coins, chocolate wrappers, hot dog wrappers on the ground. He paid attention to all of it. He hated it here. When he reached James's house, he started yelling, not even knowing what he was saying. He wasn't drunk, but he felt like he was. His blood alcohol level, even without drinking, was higher than ever. James came outside, looking out the window, trying to make sense of the situation. Michael shot 4 times at James's windows and then at his walls. Seeing the shots, James barely threw himself to the ground. Tears were streaming down Michael's face. He was crying like crazy. He didn't want to live in this world, in this place anymore. His hands were shaking. He couldn't pull the trigger anymore. Saliva was dripping from his mouth. Slowly, he opened his mouth and brought the gun to his face. He gently placed the gun between his teeth. His hands were trembling. Taking a life, giving a life, wasn't such an easy thing. He had no idea how he should act. Was he going to pull the trigger, or was he waiting for someone to tell him to stop? Was death real? Could he really die? What would happen if he stopped breathing, if his vital organs stopped working? Was there life after death? These answers were so close for Michael. Memories of all the good moments with his wife flashed before his eyes. His friends, school, family. They were all like a film reel. Michael was watching the movie where he was the main character. The film had come to its final scene. Would this movie end? Michael pulled the trigger, but the gun jammed. His eyes were closed and tears had made their way up to the gun. Was Michael happy? Sad? It was unclear. He slowly opened his eyes and heard an explosion to his left. That was the last sound he would hear in his life. James had come out of the house and shot him in the head with a bullet from behind his shoulder through the back of his ear. It was the beginning of the end for Michael. Was life really that easy to end? Was Michael's story over? What would James do now? Would he run, or would he turn himself in? We don't know the answers. All we know is that this was the miserable life of a child from a clean family who lived in America's ghettos.